The gavel crashes. Prosecutor-turned-Congressman Dan Goldman faces off against firebrand Representative Greene. "You aren't a terrorist just because a member of Congress from Georgia says you are," Goldman declares, transforming a routine hearing into constitutional warfare. This isn't about border policy. It's due process versus security, evidence versus fear. Their clash embodies America's deepening divide, with two irreconcilable visions of democracy at stake. Join us for this extraordinary confrontation where the very meaning of American justice hangs in the balance. The chamber fell into expectant silence following Goldman's opening declaration. This confrontation had been inevitable. The tension between these two representatives had been building across months of committee hearings, floor debates, and social media exchanges. They embodied the deepening fractures in American politics. Goldman, with his belief in institutions and process, Greene with her populist conviction that those very institutions had failed the American people. The legislation before them, ostensibly about reporting requirements for detained special interest aliens, was merely the latest proxy in their ongoing war of ideologies. Goldman shifted slightly in his seat as his allotted time began, his movements deliberate as he leaned toward the microphone. There was a practiced cadence to how he began speaking, not with bombast, but with the measured tone of someone accustomed to persuading skeptical juries. The room grew quieter as he laid the groundwork for his argument, framing the debate not around the specific legislation, but around the broader constitutional principles he saw at stake. "You aren't actually a terrorist just because a member of Congress from Georgia says you are," he began, his words cutting through the performative civility of the chamber. The statement landed precisely as intended, not as a direct attack, but as a defense of principle. Goldman's eyes momentarily flickered toward Greene, acknowledging without naming the target of his opening salvo. There was no theatrical gesture, no raised voice, just the calm assertion of a prosecutor laying out the parameters of his case. The staffers behind him remained impassively professional, though a few exchanged knowing glances. This was Goldman in his element, constructing an argument brick by methodical brick. As Goldman continued, his hands occasionally rose to emphasize points about due process and evidence, his fingers pressed together as if physically shaping his argument. He spoke of neutral arbiters and corroborated evidence with the passion of someone who had spent his career in courtrooms rather than on campaign trails. For Goldman, this wasn't political theater. It was about the systematic application of justice, about protecting principles that transcended partisan divisions. "There's a reason why we have due process in this country," he continued, his voice gaining intensity not through volume, but through conviction. The veins at his temples became slightly more pronounced as he described a case involving an uncorroborated statement from a confidential informant. His frustration evident not with the opposing party, but with what he perceived as an abandonment of legal standards. Across the dais, Greene's expression hardened with each passing moment of Goldman's testimony. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her fingers tapping against the wooden table, not nervously, but impatiently, like a boxer waiting for the bell. The red blazer she wore seemed to intensify in color under the harsh lights as her shoulders tensed. She scribbled notes aggressively, the scratch of her pen audible during moments when Goldman paused for breath. Her staff leaned toward her occasionally, whispering in her ear, but her eyes never left Goldman, tracking him with the focus of a predator assessing its opposition. Goldman's argument reached its crescendo not through dramatic pronouncement, but through the steady accumulation of legal reasoning. "I know there are some lawyers on the other side, some former prosecutors on the other side of the aisle who, like me, would never ever present to a judge a non-corroborated statement from a confidential informant as the basis for establishing anything, he said, his words carrying the weight of professional code rather than political positioning. The subtle shift in the room was palpable. Some committee members nodded in agreement, not necessarily with Goldman's politics, but with his procedural point. Others stiffened, perhaps recognizing their own practices being questioned. This was Goldman's strength, the ability to frame partisan disagreements as matters of professional standards, to suggest that opposition wasn't just wrong, but inconsistent with the principles of American law. As Goldman yielded back his time, he adjusted his glasses once more, a small gesture that suggested not nervousness, but completion. The conclusion of a well-executed argument. He had not raised his voice, had not made personal attacks, had not engaged in the theatrical outrage that often characterized these hearings. He had simply laid out his case, as if before a judge rather than a political committee. The effect was somehow more devastating for its restraint. The chairman's voice cut through the momentary silence, recognizing Representative Guest, who immediately yielded his time to Greene. The atmosphere in the chamber subtly shifted, the methodical legal proceedings giving way to something more volatile, more personal. Greene rose from her seat with the eagerness of someone who had been restraining herself with great difficulty. Her movements were sharp, decisive, lacking the measured calculation of her opponent. "Thank you," Greene began, her Southern accent more pronounced than usual. A tactical decision, perhaps. A reminder of her connection to the constituents she claimed to represent, the real Americans outside the Washington bubble. "I think my colleague across the aisle is very confused and maybe uneducated and uninformed of what a special interest alien is." The barb landed precisely as intended, not just challenging Goldman's position, but his competence, his understanding. Where Goldman had built his argument on legal procedure, Greene was constructing hers on the foundation of common sense and security. Her definition of special interest aliens flowed with practiced ease, as if reciting something she had internalized not just as policy, but as personal conviction. Greene's hands moved expressively as she spoke, punctuating her points with gestures that seemed to physically carve her arguments into the air between them. Unlike Goldman's restrained presentation, Greene's entire body participated in her delivery, leaning forward when emphasizing threats, straightening with indignation when referencing opposition, her voice rising and falling not with the measured cadence of legal argument, but with the passionate rhythm of a campaign rally. "It's hard for me to fathom that anyone on this committee would be opposed to simply reporting the number of special interest aliens," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the Democratic side of the dais, inviting the cameras to follow. There was a performative quality to her incredulity, a deliberate framing of her opponents not as people with different policy positions, but as individuals whose motives must be questioned. When Goldman attempted to interject, raising his finger slightly while beginning to speak, Greene's response was immediate and absolute. "No, I will not yield," she declared, her voice hardening, her hand slicing through the air in rejection. This wasn't the negotiated back and forth of traditional congressional debate. It was a declaration of conversational sovereignty, a refusal of the very premise of dialogue. The contrast between the two representatives couldn't have been more stark. Goldman with his evidence-based arguments and procedural focus, Greene with her appeal to transparency and American identity. They weren't merely disagreeing about policy, they were speaking entirely different languages, operating from fundamentally different understandings of what governance meant. Greene's voice took on a new edge as she pivoted to broader themes: the national debt, open borders, the Biden administration's policies. Her words accelerated, gaining momentum as she connected the specific legislation to her larger narrative about a government that had betrayed its citizens. "We trust the American people, and we believe they deserve transparency," she declared, her voice swelling with conviction as she positioned herself not as a politician, but as a champion of ordinary Americans against a corrupt system. Behind Goldman, staffers exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. His expression remained carefully neutral, though a muscle occasionally twitched at his jaw. The only visible sign of his response to being characterized as defending terrorists and cartels. He maintained the composed demeanor of a prosecutor listening to opposing counsel's opening statement, mentally noting points to address, rather than reacting emotionally. The temperature in the hearing room seemed to rise as Greene continued, her rhetoric becoming increasingly pointed, increasingly personal. She was no longer merely discussing policy, she was wielding emotional testimony as a political weapon. "I know too many people that have been murdered by cartels," she declared, her voice momentarily catching. Whether from genuine emotion or practiced delivery was impossible to determine. "I know too many people, and I know their families, and have watched them mourn because they have a family member that was killed by illegal alien crimes or murdered by an illegal alien or a cartel member." The invocation of murdered Americans cast a somber shadow across the proceedings. Several committee members lowered their eyes, whether in respect for the victims mentioned or discomfort at the rhetorical deployment of tragedy was unclear. Goldman's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. As a prosecutor, he had stood with victims of violent crime, had built cases against perpetrators. But he had done so through the system, with evidence, with due process. Greene's implication that opposition to her legislation equated to indifference toward these victims struck at something fundamental. Greene's voice rose as she approached her conclusion, her words taking on the rhythmic quality of a sermon. "We are all Americans, and we serve this country, not foreign countries," she proclaimed, her hand pressed against her heart for a moment, a gesture both sincere and performative. "And that should be a simple fact that we can all recognize, not have political disagreements about." The irony hung heavy in the air, her call for unity delivered through one of the most divisive presentations of the day. Committee members shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in support, others sitting back with arms crossed in indolent opposition. The chairman glanced at the clock, perhaps calculating how much longer this particular segment would last, how much tension the room could sustain. As Greene described the reporting requirements in more detail, her tone gradually shifted from emotional appeal to administrative precision, a demonstration that she understood the technical aspects of the legislation as well as its emotional resonance. "This isn't giving their name. This isn't telling what country they're from. This isn't giving their address," she enumerated, her finger tapping the table with each point. "It's simply saying how many came across the border each month. It's very simple." With those words, she yielded back her remaining time, settling into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they had not just made their point, but scored an undeniable victory. Her staff leaned in immediately, offering affirming nods and whispered comments of support. Greene took a long drink of water, her eyes still fixed on the Democratic side of the dais, waiting for the reaction she had deliberately provoked. The chairman intervened briefly, his tone suggesting growing concern about the direction of the hearing. "Let me just say this. I want us to all debate this, but let's debate the bill as much as we can," he urged, attempting to steer the proceedings back toward legislative substance rather than ideological warfare. His plea reflected the increasing challenge of maintaining procedural order in a Congress where performative confrontation often overshadowed policy deliberation. Goldman shifted forward in his seat as he was recognized once more, his movement deliberate, but carrying an energy that hadn't been present in his earlier remarks. There was something different in his posture now, a controlled intensity that suggested Greene's characterizations had touched something beyond political disagreement. When he began speaking, his voice carried the edge of someone responding not just to policy arguments, but to personal affronts. "I appreciate the lesson that Ms. Greene was trying to pass on to me," he began, the formality of his phrasing barely concealing the iron beneath. His experience as a prosecutor revealed itself not in theatrical outrage, but in his ability to turn his opponent's framing against her, to reposition the debate on his terms rather than hers. "As somebody who prosecuted organized criminal enterprises for 10 years, he continued, his credentials slipping into his argument not as boast, but as relevant context. "I can tell you that this kind of information only helps the enemy. It does not stop them." The shift was subtle, but significant. Where Greene had positioned herself as the defender of American victims against foreign threats, Goldman was now positioning himself as the experienced professional with actual knowledge of how to combat those threats effectively. His decade of experience facing actual criminals in courtrooms carried a weight different from Greene's emotional appeals. The difference between theorizing about justice and having administered it firsthand. "It's bad enough that you're misrepresenting what your bill says," he continued, his eyes now directly meeting Greene's across the dais. "But it's even worse than the fact that the information that's being provided will help the enemy and will do nothing to help keep our homeland secure." This was Goldman at his most direct, challenging not just Greene's position, but her understanding of her own legislation, suggesting that her bill would achieve the opposite of its stated intent. The accusation hung in the air for a moment, that Greene's passion for the issue was undermined by a fundamental misapprehension of security protocols, that her emotional certainty had outpaced her technical understanding. Greene's expression darkened as Goldman spoke, her jaw setting in a hard line. The redness in her cheeks might have been from anger or from the harsh lighting of the committee room, but the intensity of her gaze was unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around her pen, not nervously but with the controlled tension of someone restraining a more aggressive response. She had expected opposition, but perhaps not this particular angle of attack. Not a challenge to her competence rather than her values. Goldman concluded with precision rather than flourish, his final comment hanging in the air not as bombastic declaration, but as professional assessment. "I wish that A, we had an accurate representation from the sponsor of this bill as to what it is, and B, that if it were actually that, we'd be having a very different discussion." With those words, he yielded back his time, adjusting his papers with the methodical focus of someone who believed in systems, in process, in the power of getting the details right. He had not matched Greene's emotional appeals or her sweeping accusations. He had instead questioned the fundamental premise of her argument, suggesting that the bill itself was not what she claimed it to be, that the entire debate was occurring on false pretenses. Beyond the immediate confrontation between Goldman and Greene, the hearing room contained multitudes. Staffers whose careers were tied to their bosses' fortunes, journalists whose stories would shape public perception, citizens watching on C-SPAN whose votes would ultimately determine which vision of America prevailed. They remained largely silent throughout the exchange, their reactions confined to subtle shifts in posture, to whispered comments behind cupped hands, to notes scribbled in margins. The committee members themselves represented a microcosm of America's political divide. Some sat forward during Greene's testimony, nodding in agreement with her assertions about transparency and security. Others appeared more engaged by Goldman's procedural arguments, their expressions suggesting appreciation for his evidence-based approach, A few seemed equally dismayed by both presentations, perhaps lamenting the transformation of legislative debate into ideological performance. In the press section, journalists typed rapidly on laptops, their faces illuminated by screen glow. Some focused intently on capturing exact phrases, knowing which sound bites would drive engagement. Others scanned the room, noting the reactions of various players, constructing the narrative beyond the words being spoken. A few veterans of congressional coverage exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this drama before, with different actors but similar scripts, the ongoing American political theater, where substantive policy discussions were increasingly overshadowed by personality conflicts and culture war skirmishes. Committee staffers remained the most inscrutable, their professional masks rarely slipping. Those behind Goldman passed notes with precise language suggestions, data points, precedents to cite, the machinery of expertise supporting his presentation. Greene's team operated differently, occasionally showing more visible reactions to Goldman's comments, their notes focusing more on counter-arguments than supplementary evidence. The contrast in staff behavior mirrored the contrast in the representatives themselves, different approaches to the same fundamental task of governance. The chairman watched the exchanges with growing concern, his gaze moving between the two combatants and the clock on the wall. These hearings had time limits, procedural rules, intended outcomes, but increasingly, they served purposes beyond their official functions. They were content creation opportunities, fundraising moments, chances to signal virtue or strength to increasingly polarized constituencies. His occasional glances toward the chamber doors suggested a man wondering how much longer the institutional constraints of congressional procedure could contain the centrifugal forces pulling American politics apart. As the hearing progressed to other speakers, the confrontation between Goldman and Greene remained unresolved, not just in terms of the specific legislation, but in the larger questions their exchange had raised. What was the proper balance between security and due process? Who determined when evidence was sufficient? What responsibilities did elected officials have to prevent fear from overwhelming fact? Goldman returned to his notes, occasionally conferring with staff, his focus now on the technical aspects of the bill rather than the personal confrontation. His approach to politics remained consistent, methodical, evidence-based, grounded in legal principles. Yet there was a new alertness to his posture, a recognition, perhaps, that the battlefield had shifted, that procedural arguments alone might be insufficient in an era where emotional appeals carried increasing weight. Greene remained equally engaged, her attention constantly returning to Goldman even as other representatives spoke. She leaned toward allies on the committee, occasionally whispering comments that drew knowing nods or subtle smiles. Her confrontational style had served her well with her base. The video clips from this exchange would circulate widely online, further cementing her image as a fighter unafraid to challenge the establishment, unwilling to yield to conventional wisdom about how congressional representatives should behave. What neither could fully acknowledge was how much they needed each other, how Goldman's measured legal approach gained definition through contrast with Greene's populist passion, how Greene's emotional appeals derived power from positioning against Goldman's institutional expertise. They had become, in their opposition, perfect embodiments of America's political divide, not just disagreeing about policies, but functioning within entirely different epistemological frameworks, different understandings of what constituted truth, evidence, and proper governance. The chairman's gavel eventually signaled the conclusion of the hearing, but nothing had truly been resolved. The legislation would continue its journey through the congressional process, altered perhaps by amendments, potentially transformed by compromise, possibly defeated entirely. Goldman and Greene would return to their districts, each describing the confrontation in terms that reinforced their constituents' existing beliefs. Goldman emphasizing legal principles and factual accuracy, Greene focusing on threats to security and the need for transparency. Outside the hearing room, America continued its own unresolved journey, a nation founded on both rule of law and revolutionary passion, on both procedural safeguards and populist suspicion of elites. The confrontation between Goldman and Greene was not merely a political disagreement, but a manifestation of tensions woven into the very fabric of American democracy. Tensions that had generated both the nation's greatest achievements and its most dangerous crises. As the room emptied, the lights dimmed, and the cameras powered down, the empty chairs and scattered papers remained as silent witnesses to the ongoing American experiment, a system designed to channel conflict into constructive debate, increasingly tested by forces that threatened to overwhelm its carefully constructed constraints. Goldman and Greene had departed, but the fundamental questions their confrontation represented remained unanswered, waiting for the next hearing, the next election, the next moment when America would be forced to reckon with itself. The Capitol building stood illuminated against the darkening Washington sky, its dome a symbol of democratic aspirations that transcended any single hearing, any particular confrontation. Inside its marble halls, Goldman and Greene passed each other briefly in a corridor, exchanging the minimal acknowledgments required by congressional courtesy. Their public battle had ended for the day, but would resume tomorrow in different forms, on different issues, with the same fundamental divide underlying each encounter. What neither could fully escape was their shared participation in American democracy, a system that required opposition to function properly, that depended on the creative tension between competing visions. For all their differences, Goldman and Greene were both products of the same constitutional framework, both elected by citizens who believed in their respective approaches, both ultimately answerable to the complex, contradictory will of the American people. As they departed through separate exits, returning to offices where staff would already be preparing for the next confrontation, the weight of their responsibilities, not just to their constituents but to the constitutional system itself, followed them through the halls of power. The debate had ended, but the questions it raised about evidence, about due process, about the proper balance between security and liberty, would continue to echo through American politics long after this particular hearing had been forgotten. The cameras had stopped recording, but America's political drama continued unabated. A nation still wrestling with its founding contradictions, still seeking to form a more perfect union, still dependent on the willingness of its citizens and representatives to engage with the messy, frustrating, essential process of democratic governance. In the ongoing story of American democracy, Goldman and Greene were both protagonists and antagonists, heroes to some and villains to others. But above all, they were participants in a political tradition larger than themselves, custodians of a democratic experiment whose outcome remained uncertain, whose promise remained unfulfilled, whose burden they had chosen to bear.